So I thought I'd take a chunk of black oak that I milled with my chainsaw a few years back and make one of my 5 petal bowls out of it. And really the best way to cut a chunk of wood like this is on the bandsaw, so I brought it over there and cut up to about the rough size I needed. Now this piece of wood needed a lot of cleanup to remove the bark and all the loose stuff that was in it. My plan was to fill it up with epoxy and use that as a starting point to CNC the shape. I spent quite a bit of time cleaning it up, and then I realized the piece had a pretty good crack all the way through it. And to test that theory, I just took it and dropped it on the ground a few times, and sure enough, it split right in half. I guess the advantage of this is it gave me 2 mini live edge pieces that I could use and fill in the whole area with epoxy. Now the weird shapes and crevices were on both sides of the piece, and if I just filled it up with epoxy in one pour, I kind of knew I'd get air bubbles in it. And so my idea was to kind of seal up some of the gaps with some hot glue and cap over some of the ends and then seal it, fill up one side, and then flip it over and put the other side in the mold. And the first step was sealing it up to ensure that I didn't get any leakage deep into the piece. So I just tinted some quick drying epoxy and sealed it up with a brush. And then I tinted some deep pour epoxy and filled it up. And as I was doing this, I kind of remembered to do a trick so I can overpour it by using a little bit of silicone sealant on the edge to kind of contain it. So I went and added that and then filled it all the way up. The piece hardened about 3 days, and then I planed off all the junk on the top to make it smooth. And the next thing to do is make the mold. I start out with a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and rip some pieces. For assembling the mold, the first thing I do is I cover all the interior pieces with clear packing tape. Clear packing tape is pretty cheap. The other thing people use is tuck tape or tape that you use for house siding stuff, but it's a lot more expensive. I pre-drill some holes, add some silicone sealant on the inside and the corners to ensure I don't get any leaks, and then I just screw it together to make the basic box shape for the mold. And another trick I like to do is to assemble the box in a sort of star shape, and this makes it easier to demold because you can just tap the edges off. You also don't have to accurately measure any of the edges. The only accurate piece is the base size. Sometimes the epoxy pour will cause wood pieces to float up, and a lot of people will just put weights on the top. But another way to do it is just to use a little bit of silicone sealant on the bottom of your wood. You put a little bit on the bottom and then squish it down your piece and let it dry, and then it will not float up. So I poured the epoxy in. Again, I used a deep pour epoxy and I tinted it black. However, I had trouble. It was probably about 85 degrees in my shop, and that was just a little bit too warm for this deep of a pour. And the pour was probably 2.5 inches deep, which I thought would be okay with the amount of volume. But it wasn't, and it started to go a little bit exothermic, which caused some cracks and some bubbles. And there wasn't much I could do about it. I just had to work around it and scratch it up a bit, fill in the cracks in the tops with some more epoxy, and let it dry. I was pretty disappointed about the cracks and the bubbling, but I figured I might be able to work around it, and maybe after I machine it, the shape might look okay. So I decided to go ahead and continue with it. I demolded it, and again, that star shape that I did before makes it pretty easy. I just unscrew the screws, and then I can use a hammer to easily unmold the sides and get it all apart. A small wedge is all it takes to remove the bottom piece, and it pretty easily comes out without cracking or causing any problems or sticking. I always tend to get a little bit of chip out when planing my epoxy pieces, but for this particular shape it's not a big deal because I'm going to be putting it on the CNC machine, and a little bit of chip out on the top won't be seen because I'm going to machine it away. It probably wasn't necessary, but I did joint one edge smooth and then went ahead and cut the other edge to my rough stock size that I had set up on my model. I should mention that I did accommodate for this by making my mold be about 1/4 inch larger in each of the directions so I could trim off some of the excess. Now I'll link to my 5 petal bowl where I talk about the basic machining things I do, but basically I'm going to reiterate here. I like to use double-sided tape for the bottom so I can machine all the sides. I scrape it down really tight, and then I squish it down on a scrap piece of wood to get it to be attached really tightly to the table. I start by machining the bottom outside of the bowl first, and this is the machine moving at normal speed. I'm going to go ahead and cut to the finished piece. And here it is after it's done. I can go ahead and use a wedge to remove the piece from the little mini spoil board. And one of the things I was noticing is that I do have some holes that appeared from the exothermic reaction of the epoxy. And that's kind of a bummer. It means I'm going to have to spend a lot of time cleaning this piece up by hand. One of the hardest parts with the CNC machine is how to hold things and align things. And I use this jig that I cut out of MDF that goes around the bottom of the bowl and just sticks slightly below the surface of the bowl. I can then put some double-sided tape on it, and the jig will be used to align the piece on my other spoil board. Now, this is one of my other bowls I did, and I have another video for it. I guess I didn't do any video footage of me actually machining the epoxy one with the oak. The oak bowl had so many holes from the exothermic reaction that I had to just go around and fill them all up with epoxy. And this was a pain because after I machined it all, I had to go back and just basically reshape the bowl. And what I ended up doing was using a Dremel to kind of reshape it. I was kind of ready to just give up on this project because I didn't really want to do this. It really took a lot of time, hours and hours, to basically fill it in with epoxy, and the epoxy protrudes a bit, and then go in by hand and reshape it. And this reshaping is just a really time-consuming process. And eventually I had to get it done, sanding up to 320 in the epoxy area is 220 everywhere else. And then I could put some Osmo top oil on it and let it dry. And so here it is, the oak and black epoxy 5-petal flower bowl. And my goal with this video is to inspire you to just work through your problems and to try and finish pieces because they might turn out pretty nice in the end. And like most of my projects, I have this basic shape available as a Fusion 360 file and a STL, so you can go ahead and machine it yourself if you want to make this shape at home. And my point here is you can kind of create basically any type of shape with epoxy and wood. A lot of my other designs will look great, like the heart bowl. If you use some epoxy and wood combinations like this, you can get a lot of chaotic patterns that end up looking pretty cool. As usual, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments and I will try and answer them. Thanks, everyone.